The courtroom hummed with a low murmur of voices as the black woman entered the room, her presence commanding yet serene. The atmosphere around her seemed to shift ever so slightly, as if the very air acknowledged her arrival. She moved with a quiet confidence. As she approached the stand, her eyes focused ahead, her gaze steady, but not confrontational. The white judge barely looked up from his paperwork, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk as he shuffled through the case files, not yet having noticed the significance of the woman who stood before him. The room seemed to fade into a blur of unimportant noise, as his thoughts remained centered on the task at hand, a minor violation with no real consequences, a case to be dealt with quickly, and without fanfare. His eyes stayed on the case before him, flipping through pages with practiced indifference. The room felt stifling under the weight of his authority, and the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead filled the silence between each movement of his pen. The woman stood tall, her posture unwavering, her presence filling the space as if she knew exactly where she was and why she was there. Though the judge had not yet acknowledged it, she was not just another defendant in his courtroom. Her story was not one of small infractions and fleeting matters. She had touched the lives of thousands of children across the country, transformed the very nature of how they would learn and grow. Her name was becoming known across state lines, and yet here she stood facing the very man who would reduce her to nothing more than an administrative task on his docket, unaware of her legacy, unaware of the battles she had fought and won with nothing but her will and determination. She did not flinch, her eyes remained focused, her expression unreadable to the outside world. She appeared calm, as if this moment held no weight at all, but beneath the surface there was a quiet storm, a storm of things left unsaid, a storm that would soon burst open with the power of revelation. The judge finally glanced up from his papers, his eyes sweeping over the woman. As he adjusted his glasses, the casual glance of a man accustomed to passing judgment. With ease his eyes scanned her for a moment, his gaze fleeting before he spoke the words that would seal her fate. A fine, a simple fine, for a minor infraction. His voice was clipped, detached, without the slightest hint of recognition. His words fell into the room like a verdict of little consequence to anyone involved. He did not know the significance of the woman standing before him, nor did he care. The fine was delivered, and the matter was closed to him. This case was just another of many easily dismissed and quickly forgotten. The woman nodded, once acknowledging the ruling. Her face remained unchanged, her eyes gave nothing away. She turned on her heel and left the courtroom without a word, her footsteps echoing softly in the silence behind her, and in the eyes of those watching. A moment passed, a moment that would soon unravel into something far larger than anyone could have imagined. Outside the courthouse, the air was crisp and cold. The woman stepped out into the busy street, the clamor of passing cars and the hum of city life filling her ears. Yet she walked with purpose, as if the noise around her held no significance. Her mind was far away from the courtroom and the fine that had been imposed on her. She had long since learned that such things were trivial in the grand scheme of her mission. The world around her buzzed with a pace all its own, but her focus was fixed firmly ahead. She did not look back, not even once, not at the courthouse or the building that housed the judge who had so easily dismissed her. She knew what she was doing and where she was going. The media hadn't yet caught on to who she was, but it wouldn't take long. Her name was about to become a headline in ways she had never anticipated. She wasn't one to seek out recognition, yet fate had a way of pushing people into the spotlight, whether they were ready or not, and now it was her turn. As the woman walked briskly through the streets, her mind raced through the familiar faces and names of the people she had worked with, the allies and the adversaries alike, the long hours spent drafting policies and lobbying for education reform. Now all of that was coming to fruition. It was all happening just as she had planned. Her footsteps quickened, and she pulled the collar of her coat up to shield herself from the chill. She was on a mission, and nothing was going to stand in her way. The media quickly caught wind of who she was. The headline read like something out of a movie: a black woman fined by a white judge. But as the details unfolded, people began to realize that this wasn't just any woman. She wasn't simply a victim of an unjust fine. She was the visionary behind federal education reform, the very reforms that had altered the way the nation approached learning. She was the force that had pushed for equality in education for every child in the country, whether they were in affluent neighborhoods or struggling inner cities. She had led the charge for greater access to resources and better opportunities for those who had long been denied it. Her name spread quickly across news outlets and social media, as people began to connect the dots between the woman who had been so casually fined and the groundbreaking work she had done. Her influence in the education system had been far-reaching and transformative, and now the world knew her story. The judge, back in the courtroom, sat at his desk, unaware of the storm that was brewing outside his chambers. He was still going through cases when his clerk entered with a look of surprise and urgency. She handed him a news report showing the woman's identity and her accomplishments. The judge glanced at the article, his eyebrows furrowing, as the words began to sink in. The fine he had just imposed was for a woman who had shaped the very policies he had likely heard about in the news over the past few years. He felt a shift in his chest as the realization hit him like a jolt of electricity. How could he have missed it? How could he have dismissed her so easily? The judge stared at the article in his hands, his mind racing. As he tried to process the information, it wasn't just that she had been a part of something big, it was that she had been the driving force behind it all. He felt a wave of embarrassment flood over him, the weight of his oversight sinking in deeper with every word. He read the woman he had just fined was no ordinary citizen. She was the one who had pushed for the very education reforms that had shifted the national conversation, that had shaped the future of millions of children across the country. He could feel the walls of his office closing in as the reality of the situation set in. How had he been so blind, so disconnected from the significance of what he had just done? This wasn't just a fine. This was a missed opportunity, a failure of recognition. He had passed judgment on someone who had changed the world without ever realizing it. The room felt colder now as the judge sat back in his chair, his thoughts tumbling over each other. He tried to recall the details of the case, her case, and the blankness that had filled his mind. When she stood before him, she hadn't been loud or boastful. She hadn't demanded any special treatment. She had simply been present, calm, poised, and completely unassuming. And yet she was everything but ordinary, everything but forgettable. He thought back to the way she had accepted the fine without protest, her quiet dignity in the face of his ruling. He remembered the way her presence had filled the room, and how, despite his indifference, she had stood unshaken, as if she knew exactly who she was and what she had accomplished. But now he saw it all clearly. The gravity of the moment weighed on him. It was like a dam had broken, and everything that had been hidden beneath the surface came rushing to the forefront. He had dismissed her with the same casual authority he had given to every case before hers. And now he realized how much he had missed, how much he had failed to see. In that brief exchange, the media was already buzzing about her, and the judge felt a knot form in his stomach. The realization of his mistake was becoming public knowledge. The story was already out there now, and his role in it was anything but flattering. He could already imagine the headlines: the judge who fined the architect of education reform. The thought made his skin crawl. How could he have been so blind? How could he have failed to see the significance of the woman standing before him? How could he have missed the very essence of her work, the impact she had made? Her name was no longer just a name, it was a symbol of change and progress. But to the judge, she had been just another case, just another number in a sea of routine legal matters. The truth of it felt like a heavy weight on his chest. And he knew he couldn't just ignore it. He had to make things right. But where to begin? The thought of apologizing seemed almost too simple. But it was all he had left now. All he could do was face the reality of his mistake, and hope that somehow he could find a way to make amends. The judge sat in silence for what felt like hours as the weight of his realization pressed heavily on him. His mind spun with questions that had no immediate answers. How had he let this happen? How had he failed to recognize the magnitude of the woman standing before him? And now the world knew her story. But all he could think about was the injustice of his own actions. He picked up his phone, with shaky hands dialing the number of his clerk, who had handed him the news report earlier. She answered on the first ring, her voice calm and professional. Despite the storm of emotions brewing in his mind, he felt a lump form in his throat, and for a moment he couldn't find the words. He simply stared at the phone screen. Before speaking, her name came out in a whisper, and he felt embarrassed by how small it sounded in that moment, his usual authority slipping away with every passing second. She waited for him to continue, and when he finally spoke, his words were slow and filled with an overwhelming sense of regret. "I need to do something," he said, his voice tight. I need to do something about this. She paused for a moment before responding, Sir, I think we need to address this publicly. The gravity of what you're saying is already beginning to hit the news outlets, and it will spread fast. She spoke with an urgency that mirrored his own. The situation was no longer something that could be swept under the rug. It was bigger than his courtroom, and his decision. It had far-reaching implications, and the press would make sure of it. The judge nodded. Though she couldn't see him, he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He had never felt more like a fool in his entire career. The realization was sharp and cutting. Every second that passed made it worse. His mistake wasn't just about his judgment. It was about what it meant. The woman he had found was no ordinary citizen. She was a pioneer. And now that the world knew her story, he couldn't hide from the truth anymore. The clerk continued talking, but the judge's mind wandered back to the moment she had walked into the courtroom. He remembered how her quiet strength had stood out from the crowd, how she hadn't seemed fazed by the fine, how she had accepted it without hesitation. But now he saw her with new eyes. She wasn't just someone who would be forgotten after her case was done. She was someone who had changed history, and he had missed it completely. He slammed the phone down in frustration, unable to keep it together anymore. What had he done? He sat at his desk, staring blankly at the papers in front of him, his mind a whirl of confusion and regret. He knew that he had to apologize publicly, that much was clear. But what could he possibly say that would make any difference? He had judged her as though she were a mere footnote in a casebook, when in reality she had written the book on progress and equality in education. He let out a frustrated sigh, knowing that no apology would ever truly erase the damage done. But it was the only thing left for him to do. His thoughts raced through possible statements. What could he say to make it right? How could he face her after this, after everything she had done? And he had missed the importance of it all. There was no way to undo the fine, but he could make an effort to restore some of the respect he had taken from her. The judge sat motionless at his desk, staring blankly at the walls, his thoughts racing, yet his mind still felt clouded, as if the weight of the mistake he had made was too much for him to bear. Every possible action seemed inadequate. Every possible apology seemed hollow. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, each beat a reminder of how far he had fallen from his usual self-assurance. The usual sense of control that came with being a judge was slipping away from him, and in its place was a gnawing sense of shame. The woman he had found was a giant in a world of giants, and here he was a man who had failed to recognize her significance. But more than that, he had failed to recognize the human element behind the legal matters he dealt with every day. She was not just a case number. She was a person who had impacted millions of lives in a way he could never even dream of. And he had dismissed her without a second thought. The sound of his phone buzzing pulled him from his spiraling thoughts. He picked it up without looking at the screen, already knowing it was his clerk again. "What's the news this time?" he asked, his voice tight and strained. He heard her take a breath before answering. "Sir, the story is gaining more traction. It's all over social media, and the national news outlets are picking it up. Your role in this has become the focal point. The focus is shifting from her accomplishments to your oversight, and the public is beginning to question how this could have happened." The judge's stomach churned as he listened to his clerk's words. He had imagined the story breaking, but hearing the reality of it made him sick to his core. His mistake had gone from a private error to a very public scandal, and there was no way to reverse the damage already done. The judge leaned back in his chair, his eyes closing. As he took a deep breath, he knew he had to act fast. But even as the words formed in his mind, they seemed inadequate. How could he possibly apologize in a way that mattered? How could he possibly undo the harm he had caused? He was no stranger to the concept of power and consequence. But in this moment, it seemed that the weight of his actions had far outstripped his understanding. He looked at the photo of the woman again, the one that had accompanied the news articles. Her face was calm, but there was an undeniable strength behind her eyes. She had faced challenges that most people would never even imagine, and she had come out on top. She was not just an activist, she was a visionary. And here he was feeling small in comparison. He knew he could not hide from this mistake any longer. It was too big, too public, and too important to sweep under the rug. He had to take responsibility for it. And yet the fear of how people would see him kept him rooted in indecision. How could he face the public? How could he face her, the woman who had changed the course of education For an entire generation, how could he possibly repair the damage done by his own ignorance and short-sightedness? It was a question that lingered in the air as the hours passed by without an answer. But deep down, he knew the only thing he could do now was take action, whatever the consequences, whatever the fallout. He had to make things right, even if it meant risking his own reputation, even if it meant swallowing his pride. He knew that he had no other choice but to confront the situation head-on. The judge finally stood from his desk, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his jacket. He had to do something even if he didn't know what that something was, yet the weight of the situation pressed down on him, making his steps heavier than they should have been. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a storm. He had no hope of controlling his mind, kept replaying the moment she had entered the courtroom, the calm, unflinching presence, and how he had missed everything in her eyes. He thought about the fine he had imposed, how it had seemed so small, so inconsequential. But now it felt like the most critical mistake of his career. He had underestimated her. He had underestimated the power she wielded, the lives she had touched, and now it was too late to undo the damage. The judge walked through the hallway toward his clerk's office, each step feeling like it was pushing him further into the fire that was quickly becoming his reality. When he arrived, she looked up at him with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Sir," she asked, as he walked in, "have you come to a decision?" The judge looked at her, not entirely sure of the answer yet, but knowing that he couldn't delay much longer. "I need to speak with her," he said quietly, his voice filled with a level of humility he rarely allowed himself to show. The clerk raised an eyebrow. "Is that wise, sir? Don't you think the public reaction will be overwhelming if you take this on personally, if you apologize to her directly?" The judge's eyes darkened slightly. "I don't care about the public reaction. I care about making this right. And that's the only thing that matters now." He turned toward the door, and she followed close behind. As they walked together, the weight of his words hung in the air like a heavy fog. It wasn't just about his public image anymore. It was about confronting his own failure. The magnitude of his ignorance had been a wake-up call. And now he had to face the woman who had been at the center of it all, the woman whose work had changed the lives of so many children and families, who had sacrificed so much to get to where she was now. When they reached the front of the building, the judge hesitated, his mind racing with every possible outcome of this encounter. What if she refused to speak with him? What if she didn't care about his apology at all? What if this whole thing made things worse? He had no way of knowing for certain. But what he did know was that he couldn't leave things the way they were. It wasn't enough to send a statement or make a comment in the press. He had to speak to her face to face and let her know that he saw her now. He saw who she was and the incredible impact she had made on the country's future. And yet, even as he stood outside the doors to face her, there was a part of him that feared the possibility that his mistake was too big to ever be corrected. What if she couldn't forgive him? What if his apology didn't matter? What if his public apology only added to the weight of the situation? He was too afraid to go back to the courtroom. Now the thought of facing those who had witnessed his initial dismissal of her made his stomach twist. But he knew that facing her was the only chance he had to start mending the broken pieces of his own pride and his responsibility. The judge stood motionless for a long moment, his hand hovering over the door handle, his heart racing in his chest. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to return to his office and pretend none of this had ever happened. But deep down, he knew he couldn't run from the reality of the situation. He had already let this mistake go too far, and the longer he waited, the more his guilt would eat at him. His eyes flicked to his clerk, who stood by his side, watching him silently, waiting for him to take action. But even her presence didn't seem to steady him. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as if he was stepping into an unknown world where everything he knew about his role and his power no longer mattered. With a final deep breath, he grasped the door handle and pulled it open. The cold air outside rushed in, greeting him with an almost mocking chill. It was as though the world itself was questioning him, daring him to face the consequences of his own actions. The judge stepped into the street and immediately spotted the woman. She was standing a few paces away, her face turned toward him. But her expression was unreadable. She wasn't looking at him with anger or resentment, but there was something in her eyes that he couldn't quite decipher. It was a mix of curiosity and worriness, like she wasn't sure whether to trust him or not. He moved toward her slowly, each step deliberate, but filled with hesitation. He could feel his palms sweating, his pulse thundering in his ears. But he pressed forward, because he knew that there was no other choice, no other option, but to speak to her, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. When he reached her, he paused, standing just a few feet away. He took a deep breath and tried to steady his voice. "Ma'am," he began, his words coming out shaky but sincere, "I owe you an apology, and I need you to hear me out." She looked at him, then her gaze, intense yet calm, her eyes held no hint of surprise, as if she had known this moment would come, the moment where he would have to face the truth of his own ignorance. She didn't say anything at first, she simply waited for him to continue. The judge swallowed hard, trying to find the right words to convey the weight of his regret, to express the enormity of his mistake. But all that came out was the bare truth. "I was wrong," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "and I failed to see who you really are. I didn't understand the magnitude of your work or the impact you've had. And I have made a grave error." He glanced up, meeting her gaze, finally seeing her for who she truly was, not just a woman standing before him, but a force of nature, a visionary who had changed the educational landscape for millions of children across the country. "I didn't recognize your contributions," he continued, his voice softer now, "and for that, I am deeply sorry. I misjudged you, and I can't undo that, but I hope you can find it in yourself to see that I recognize it now, and I will do whatever I can to make it right." Her expression remained calm as she listened, but he could tell that she was processing his words carefully, not offering an immediate response. Her silence hung in the air between them, but it wasn't cold or dismissive. It was measured, thoughtful, as if she were deciding what to say next, and the judge felt the weight of that silence deep in his chest, every second of it feeling like an eternity. He could feel the eyes of the public on them now, even though they weren't physically there. The consequences of this moment would stretch far beyond the two of them. But in this instant, it was just the two of them standing on the cold street, one seeking redemption, and the other carrying the weight of history in her eyes. The silence stretched between them, heavy and filled with unspoken words. The woman stood still, her gaze unwavering. As she listened to the judge's apology, he could see the wheels turning in her mind. But she didn't offer any immediate response. Her face remained composed, but he could sense the layers of thought beneath the surface. He wanted to fill the silence with more words, to explain himself further, but he knew that was not what was needed right now. Instead, he waited, hoping that somehow his sincerity would be enough for her to understand the gravity of his words. After what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke, her voice calm and measured. "I appreciate your apology," she said, "but apologies are not always enough." Her words struck him like a punch to the chest, and he felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. She wasn't angry with him, at least not in the way he expected, but her words were sharp and clear, as though she was reminding him of a truth he hadn't fully grasped. Yet she paused for a moment, looking at him with an intensity that made him feel as though she was seeing through him. She took a slow breath and continued, "What matters now is what you do with this moment," she said, her voice steady. "You've realized your mistake, and that's important, but the real question is whether you will take responsibility for it in a way that impacts more than just your personal guilt, whether you will take action that speaks louder than your words." The judge nodded slowly, understanding the weight of her statement. Her words weren't just about him, they were about the larger issue at hand, about what his failure represented for a system that had long overlooked those who worked for real change. He had been a part of that system, the same system that had failed to recognize the importance of what she had done. He had been blinded by his own position, his own authority, and now she was challenging him to do something bigger than himself. He knew that no amount of apology could erase the damage he had done, but maybe there was still a chance for him to redeem himself, not just in her eyes, but in the eyes of those he had let down, the children, the families, the communities who depended on the reforms she had fought so hard to implement. He swallowed hard, his voice steady, but laced with regret. "What would you have me do?" he asked her, not knowing if there was any real way to make up for the harm he had caused. She looked at him for a moment longer, as if weighing the sincerity of his question, and then her expression softened slightly. "If you are truly committed to making this right," she said, "then use your position to amplify the work that I have done. Don't just offer an apology to me. Do something that benefits the people who are still fighting for the changes we need. Make it clear that this is not about me, it's about the future of education." It's about giving children the opportunities they deserve. The judge felt a weight settle on his shoulders. As her words sunk in, she wasn't asking for a simple gesture of contrition. She was asking for something more profound, a commitment to act in ways that would have a lasting impact on the systems. He had once been a part of the systems that had overlooked the work she had done. He knew that this was not going to be easy, that his position would make it difficult. But for the first time he understood that true redemption came from action, not words. He nodded solemnly. "I will do that," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I will do what I can to make this right." Her gaze softened just a little. And for the first time since they had begun speaking, there was a sense of understanding between them. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was the beginning of a new conversation, one where the judge understood his place, and where she made it clear that the real work was just beginning. The judge took a step back as her words lingered in the air, a sense of determination growing within him, but also a sense of unease. He had been given a chance to make things right, but he knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. It would be a long journey filled with hard decisions and difficult conversations. But there was no turning back now. He had made a promise, and he intended to keep it. Her words had opened something inside him, a shift in perspective that he couldn't ignore. He had spent years sitting on the bench passing judgment on others, but he had never truly examined the broader picture. Until now he had never truly understood the weight of his decisions, the lives they affected, the consequences they carried. He had been blind to the realities that so many people had to live with, and now he had to confront that truth head-on. As he stood there facing her, he realized that his apology was just the first step. It wasn't enough to simply say the right words. He had to back them up with action. He had to prove that he was willing to be a part of the change that she had fought so hard for. And that wasn't going to be easy. He could already feel the resistance in his gut. The systems he had been a part of were deeply entrenched, and it would take more than just a gesture to shake them. But he was ready to try. For the first time, he felt the weight of his role as a judge, not as a position of power, but as a responsibility to those whose lives were shaped by the decisions he made. He looked at the woman. Once more her expression was still unreadable, but there was something in her eyes that told him she wasn't expecting immediate results. She wasn't looking for a perfect response. She was looking for commitment to the work ahead, and the recognition of how much there was left to be done. He took another deep breath and straightened his posture. "I will start by using my platform," he said slowly. "I'll use my position to advocate for the changes that are needed to ensure that every child gets the education they deserve. And I'll work to make sure that the work you've done doesn't go overlooked again. I will speak out and take actions that support the reforms you've pushed for. I may not know exactly what that will look like yet, but I know I can no longer stay silent in the face of what's at stake." She nodded, once her gaze still steady, as if weighing his words. She didn't smile, but there was a flicker of something in her expression. Maybe it was trust, maybe it was something more, but whatever it was enough to let him know that he had taken the first step in earning back her respect, and the respect of those who mattered most, the children whose futures were still uncertain. If the changes they fought for were ever truly realized, there was a lot of work ahead of him. But for the first time in a long while, the judge felt as though he was on the right path, the path toward redemption, not just for himself, but for the system he had once thought he fully understood. He looked at her one last time, and without saying another word turned and began walking toward the courthouse. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that this was the beginning of something bigger than himself, a chance to make things right, and maybe, just maybe, to change the system that had failed so many for so long. As the judge walked back into the courthouse, the weight of what he had just committed to seemed to grow heavier with each step he took. The halls felt different now, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on him, reminding him of everything he had just promised to do. It wasn't just a matter of facing the woman he had wronged. It was about facing everything he had once believed to be true about his role in the system. The work ahead was vast, and the consequences of his actions would follow him for as long as he remained in his position. But for the first time, he felt a sense of purpose, a sense of clarity that had been missing from his life for years. He wasn't simply a judge anymore. He was someone who had to actively shape the future of education, someone who had to take responsibility for the ways his decisions had contributed to the larger system of inequality and injustice. He entered his office and closed the door behind him. his eyes falling on the stack of cases waiting for his attention. But today, those cases felt insignificant in comparison to what he had just promised to do. He sat down at his desk, staring at the pile of papers. Before him they were familiar, but now they seemed distant, as if they belonged to a past version of himself. He couldn't simply return to business as usual. After everything that had transpired, his mind kept returning to the woman's words. She hadn't asked for perfection. She hadn't demanded immediate results. But she had asked for him to act and to hold himself accountable in a way that truly mattered. He thought about the work she had done, how she had fought for change, even when the odds were stacked against her, and how she had done it with grace and determination. She had made an impact on a scale that few people could ever dream of, and now it was his turn to step up and make his own impact. He looked down at the papers in front of him and began to make a plan. He would start by reaching out to education reform groups and community organizations. He would use his position to raise awareness about the issues they were working to address. He would advocate for policy changes and push for a system that didn't just serve the wealthy and the privileged, but one that served all children equally. He knew that this would be a long and difficult journey, but it was one he had to take. It wasn't just about changing the system. It was about changing himself. He couldn't continue living in ignorance. He couldn't ignore the realities that had been laid bare before him. He had to fight for what was right, not just for his own sake, but for the sake of those who had been forgotten for far too long. As he picked up the phone to make the first of many calls, his resolve solidified. He knew that the road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in his career, he felt like he was truly doing the work that mattered. He wasn't just a judge anymore. He was a part of something much bigger than himself, and he couldn't afford to let that responsibility slip away from him. Now the path forward was unclear, but the commitment he had made to the woman, to the children, to the future of education was something he would not turn away from. He was ready to fight for it, even if it meant facing the hardest battles of his life.